Okay, without further ado, Anthony Leiserowitz, the director of the Yale program on climate change, one of the most important climate change communicators of our time. And I'm so excited. Over to you.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Let's make sure we got technical things working out here. So first of all, can you see my screen okay?
Looks good.
All right, great. All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation to be with you all. Good afternoon, good evening to those of you. So my name is Tony Leiserowitz. I'm a professor here at the Yale School of the Environment, where I direct the Yale program on climate change communication. Just to give you a quick overview of who we are and what we do, we study how do people around the world respond to the issue of climate change. So what do they understand and misunderstand about the causes, consequences, and solutions? How do they perceive the risks? So the likelihood and severity of different types of impacts. What kinds of policies do people support or oppose? And then what kinds of behaviors are people already engaging in or willing to adopt in order to maintain a safe and stable climate? And then as scientists, our ultimate question then is why? What are the underlying psychological, cultural, political reasons why some people get really engaged with this issue? Others are kind of apathetic, and some are downright dismissive and hostile, or at least they are here in the United States. So we work at many different scales, and so what I'm going to be sharing with you today is a body of work that we call Climate Change in the American Mind. This is a project we've been doing in partnership with our dear friends and colleagues at the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication for the past 18 years, where we do nationally representative surveys, 2 of them a year, every spring, every fall, every spring, every fall, and have now been doing that for nearly 2 decades. Really an incredible data set. And we've explored so many different themes within that, and I'll just share a few of those with you here. We also have generated tools, which I'll share with you, our segmentation analyses, message experiments, and then we also do a lot of work internationally. So we've done the first ever studies in China, India, Brazil. We're partnering with the Irish government. We're doing work in Indonesia, and then globally in about 190 countries and territories around the world. So while I'm going to really focus here on the United States, happy to take questions about anything going on internationally if people have them. Secondly, we also have a very robust partnership program. So if you see things here that you're interested in following up on, please reach out to us. We have a whole team that's just devoted to helping everything from governments to companies to educators, including a lot of people in the informal education sector, better do climate communication, especially strategic climate communication with their respective audiences. And then last but not least, 15 years ago, we started our own climate news service called Climate Connections. We have a team of reporters across the country doing stories about climate change. We have a wonderful feature called Eye on the Storm with 2 of the world's leading meteorologists talking about how real world or real-time climate extreme events are related to climate change. And then for the past 10 years, our own national radio program called Climate Connections, where we do very short 1.5-minute stories, a brand new story every day, and it plays several times a day on over 750 radio stations across the country. And I'm going to emphasize that just a little bit because if you want to see how we try to apply many of the principles I'm going to be talking about here tonight in practice, that's actually a really good place to look, because the way that we've structured those stories is very much rooted in what we've learned in the research. And then very uniquely for a news service, we take the stories that we broadcast and we bring them back into the research environment and test them with our different target audiences, because in the end, we want to make sure that we are helping people better understand what climate change is and what the solutions are. So encourage you to look at that. Okay, so with that out of the way, let me just turn to our discussion here about climate change in the American mind. Let me just start with a basic proposition, and that is that it would be great. It would be wonderful if every American and everyone else around the world could have the equivalent of Climate Change 101. So a full semester course, preferably taught at Yale, but other universities could get in the act, that is dedicated to really understanding, here's how the climate system works. Here's what the causes and the consequences and solutions of climate change are. That would, let's really dig in and understand those details. That would be great, but the sad reality is that's never going to happen. Okay? It's never going to happen. not in a country of over 300 million people, and certainly not on a planet of 8 to 10 billion people. Okay. So the really important and interesting question there is, given that most people are always going to have limited shelf space in their brains devoted to climate change, or frankly, any important issue, what are the most important things that people should know? Okay, now as educators, you have a bit more latitude because you get to actually have a captive audience where you get to, I'm going to use the word force, but I don't mean that pejoratively. You get to encourage them to learn many more details. I'm primarily, however, talking about the general public, and even so, the principles I'm going to talk about here are, I think, quite relevant to students as well as cornerstones, as foundation of climate literacy. So in other words, let's just say you've got enough space in most people's heads for 5 key ideas. What would you want them to know about climate change? Is it vital that all Americans understand how the carbon cycle works? Probably not. Is it vital that they know exactly how many parts per million of CO2 is in the atmosphere at any given time? Probably not. And in the course of our work and some of our colleagues across the country and around the world, we think we've identified at least 5 key ideas, 5 fundamental facts about climate change that we think everyone ought to understand. And moreover, we boiled those 5 key ideas down to just 10 words, but a friend of mine who used to be in Congress likes to do haiku on the side, so I'm going to give you her 11-word version instead. And here we go.
And Tony, we're still seeing your first slide.
Yeah, I'm just turning to the 5 key ideas. And here they are. Scientists agree. It's real. It's us. It's bad, but there's hope. Now that's really simple. And on the one hand, that's actually an incredible advantage, okay? Simplicity. Because communication is fundamentally very much captured in the party game telephone. I don't know if any of you have ever played telephone at a party, but it's basically where you take a group of people, you put them around a table, the first person grabs a card, and there's a sentence on the card, they have to read the sentence, then whisper that sentence to the person sitting next to them, who whispers it to the person sitting next to them, and all the way around the table. And by the time you get to the end, that last person then has to say the sentence aloud. And what you always find is that the sentence is completely different than where it started. Okay, and it's actually fun to go back and trace where the changes really happened. Okay, well, that in microcosm is communication. Okay, the ultimate test of communication is not just how well does your audience or your student understand what you said, but then how well can they go home and say with high fidelity the same idea onto their brother or their sister or their parents or their grandparents. Okay, that is the essence of communication, because communication spreads through our social networks. And so the simpler your message, the more likely it is to be able to go from one person to the next without getting completely distorted. But the other is that these are deceptively simple. I like to call these meta ideas because, in fact, each one of them can be instantiated with dozens, hundreds, thousands of examples that basically back up each one of these. So in other words, these are conclusions that you're trying to draw in the mind of your audience with many, many, many examples and data points and so on. Here are all the ways that we know that climate change is happening. Okay, we're looking at observations from the sun, and we're looking at temperatures in the atmosphere and in the oceans and in the cryosphere, that's the snow and ice on the planet, in boreholes in the earth, and so on and so forth. It's all telling us the same basic message. Here are all the ways that we know that climate change is caused by human beings. Of course, the climate has changed naturally over millions and even billions of years of Earth history, but this time it's different. This time it's the direct result of us digging coal, oil, and gas up out of the ground and setting it on fire to power our societies. A 19th century energy system, creating this heat-trapping blanket around the Earth, which is causing ever more extreme weather events, sea level rise, and so on. Here are the thousands of ways that climate change is bad right now. And of course, the thousands of ways that it's going to become much worse if we continue on the current path. And then last but not least is that there's hope, which is really just a way of capturing that there are solutions. And so right up front, I'm going to just make a quick academic social psychological point, which is that in essence, there are 2 basic kind of concepts that you need to communicate to people. One is an adequate and clear-eyed understanding of the threat that we face. This is the field that we call risk perception. People have to know why this matters. They have to know what's at stake. So it is important that we communicate what climate change is and why we care. But at the same time, you also need to build what's called a sense of efficacy, an understanding that there are solutions, that we have the ability to implement those solutions, and most importantly, that if we implement them, it will make a difference. Because if you only have the sense of threat without the sense of efficacy, then many people's response is like, I can't do anything about that, so I'm just going to ignore this issue or just not see how I can be part of the solution at all. Okay, so you really need both. And in fact, you can't just talk about solutions unless you understand why those solutions are important. Okay, so I'm just saying you're really trying to engage people on both of those fronts. Okay, so with these ideas in mind, let's take a look at how Americans are currently thinking and responding in these exact themes. So again, I'm going to show you some nationally representative survey results from our work with our friends at George Mason University. And what you're looking at here is the full time series. So here's when we first did our first survey back in 2008, when at the time, we were kind of at a high watermark. 71% of Americans understood that global warming is happening. We then saw a 14 percentage point drop, bottoming out in 2010. And since then, it's been slowly working its way back up. And this is as of just last December, so just a couple months ago, where 73% of Americans think climate change is happening. So overall, that's pretty good. We're pretty close to our all-time high. Good job, America. That's great. But just to put that in a little bit of international context, if we were in Brazil or Japan, this number would be over 95%. So yes, it's a clear majority of Americans that understand it's happening, but that doesn't mean that it's anything close to where the rest of the world is. Okay, so this is happening. Do people understand that it's human caused? Well, again, here's that same pattern, 57% back in 2008, big drop, working its way back up. And as of just a couple months ago, it's at 60%. But by contrast, you still have 28% of Americans who think that global warming is mostly natural. And that's a fundamental and important misunderstanding, because if it's just natural cycles, then many people think like, we didn't have anything to do with it. We can't really do much about it. So they don't take it all that seriously, or they think maybe it's just something we can, adapt our way out of. Of course, that's not the situation. This is entirely caused by human activities, not even mostly. In fact, you could argue it's 110% caused by human activities, because if anything, the climate would be cooling slightly right now. So this is still a fundamental fact and a fundamental communication need to help people understand that this is something being caused by human beings, most notably the burning of fossil fuels and land use change. And then we come to, do people understand the scientific consensus? So there are different ways to ask this question, but this one directly says, what percentage of climate scientists think that human-caused global warming is happening? And that's all this question is. Is it real, and is it human-caused? Not what's going to happen to the Indian monsoon in the year 2075, about which there's enormous uncertainty. The fundamentals. Is it real? Is it human-caused? About which there is no legitimate scientific dispute at all. In fact, numerous studies say that it's anywhere between 97 and 99% consensus about these fundamental facts. And yet, only 1 in 5 Americans knows that it's more than 9 out of 10 scientists. Okay? And this is a consequential misunderstanding, because most people understand that they are not experts about climate change. And frankly, this is true of many other issues as well. And so if your perception is that the experts, the scientists, are still arguing amongst themselves whether this is even a problem, then many people just adopt a wait and see attitude. They're basically saying, hey, scientists, go off in a room somewhere and haggle this out. And if it's a serious problem, you'll come tell us, right? Not realizing, of course, that the scientific community did that literally decades ago. So this is a highly consequential misunderstanding, and it's not by accident. This is an engineered misunderstanding. So there are a number of factors that go into this. One is that scientists aren't the best communicators in the world. It's not our day job. Most of us just want to be doing our data analysis and our climate science work. So as a community, we have not always been the best communicators about what we've learned. That's true. Secondly, there was a longstanding norm within media reporting of false balance. where basically they would say, well, it's a norm adopted from political reporting. So if a Democrat says something, then you should go hear what a Republican has to say. But unfortunately, they applied that political norm to science, where there's actual fact versus non-fact. And so what you often got were these kind of crossfire type moments where they would put an esteemed climate scientist up next to an industry hack. And frankly, the industry hack was better groomed and better at communicating than the scientist in many cases. So that was a longstanding problem. It's less of a problem today. But the other that we just have to understand is that this is also the result of a very well financed and highly sophisticated misinformation, disinformation campaign that has been financed by the fossil fuel industry and its allies over decades. This is the exact same strategy that was first developed by this tobacco industry in which they understood back in the 1950s that they couldn't convince Americans that smoking was good for you, but they could convince Americans that the science wasn't settled yet. And it's literally in their strategy documents, doubt is our product. And so as long as they could sell the sense that the scientific community just hasn't yet figured out whether smoking is bad, people would keep smoking. And they did for decades. So the industry raked billions of extra dollars into their pockets because of this very effective strategy. That exact same strategy, including some of the same, quote, experts that were disputing the health consequences of smoking, got imported root and branch right into the climate space, where, again, they argued climate change isn't real, it's not human caused, there is no scientific consensus about these fundamental facts. And so what you're seeing is that many Americans still believe that fundamental misunderstanding. So the larger communication and education point is that we still need to communicate this. And what we find in our message tests is that when you communicate that there is this scientific consensus that human caused global warming is happening, people update their views. They become more convinced that it is happening and human caused. They become more worried about it, and they become more supportive of taking action on it. So it's just to say this is like a key. It can help unlock one of the major barriers in the public mind. Okay, and then this brings us to whether we're worried about it. And so what you can see is that worry has grown pretty much over the 18 years. So we got almost 2/3 of Americans are at least somewhat worried, but only 28% are very worried. And this stands in for a whole bunch of other risk perception questions. So why aren't we that worried about it? Well, what we've seen from the very beginning of these studies is that for many people, even those that accept that it's happening in human cause, they still think of climate change as a distant problem. Distant in time, that the impacts won't be felt for a generation or more, and distant in space. This is about polar bears, or maybe some developing countries, but not the United States, not my state, not my community, not my friends, not my family, not me. And as a result, it's psychologically distant. It just becomes one of 100 issues that's out there. Maybe I kind of wish somebody would do something about it, but I don't understand why this is important. I don't understand why this is urgent. So another critical thing that we still have to get across to people is that climate change impacts are not distant in time and space. They're happening right here, right now. They're already killing people. They're already harming property. They're already affecting us in some profound ways. Climate change isn't just in our backyard. It's in the basement. The call's now coming from inside the house. Okay, and so on that exact point, we see that, in fact, Americans are increasingly understanding that global warming is harming people in the United States now. So we go back to 2010, it was only 24% of Americans understood that, and it's basically doubled over that time period up to now 48%. So yay, good, but it's still less than half of Americans. So we have a long way to go to helping people understand this is here and now. And likewise, we've seen a similar thing in people saying that they have personally experienced the effects of global warming. Basically, it's more than doubled, but it's still less than 50% who understand that they have experienced the effects. In fact, everyone in America has experienced the effects. They just don't know it. So it's still an incredibly important thing to communicate. Okay. And why don't we take this issue more seriously? Well, at its core, it's because most of us hear about this so rarely. Only 25% of Americans hear about global warming in the media even once a week. or 13% hear about it on social media, and only 6% say they hear people they know talking about global warming even once a week, and once a week is not often. Okay, I've actually done this side research, and it's very true that the amount of news coverage, for example, of Taylor Swift blows away the amount of total coverage of climate change. Okay, and that's no shade on Taylor Swift. She deserves all the attention she gets. But I'm just saying, for an existential crisis like we are confronting with climate change, it's stunning how rarely we hear about it. And if nobody's talking about it, then most people conclude then it can't be that important, because we talk about the things that are really important. Okay. So for many people, this issue is basically out of sight and out of mind. Okay, so another way that I want to get at this is a tool that we developed about 10 years ago called the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. And basically this came from many presentations we'd give. We'd share these national results and people say, hey, this is really cool. This is great. Thank you so much. It's very informative. But I'm doing an initiative in Dallas, Texas. Like, what can you tell me about Dallas? And the short answer was, I can't tell you anything about Dallas because I don't have the resources to go do studies in every single city in the country or every state in the country, et cetera. So what we were able to do is to do something kind of parallel to climate science. We were able to build this downscaling tool where we can take our national level data and develop these very accurate estimates for all 50 states, all 435 congressional districts, the 1,000 largest cities, and 3,000 plus counties. We've even pushed this technique all the way down to the census tract level, which is essentially neighborhood scale. And that has really unlocked enormous value for so many people. So let me show you what I mean. So here's what we would usually be able to say. Here's the percentage of adults who are worried about global warming in 2023, 64%. Okay, that's nice to know, but again, not very helpful if you're working at the state and local level. Well, here's what it looks like at the county level. And what you can very quickly see, darker and darker shades of red are a larger and larger majority of people in that county who who are worried about it, sorry. In darker shades of blue is where a smaller minority of people are worried about climate change. And what you can immediately see is that there's enormous variation across the country. Americans don't have the same viewpoint everywhere. I love this map. There's so many stories in it, but I just want to point to one of my favorites, and that is the state of Texas. Now, in many people's minds, stereotypically thinking, Texas is a deep red conservative state. It's long been led by climate-denying governors. It's the home of the oil industry. It seems like it would be the last place you could have a constructive conversation about climate change. Turns out that's not true. And in fact, what we find is that these counties down here, right along the border, are actually more worried about climate change than most of the liberal counties in California. Why is that? Well, that aligns with some of our other research, which has found that contrary to common wisdom, which is that this is an issue that only white, well-educated, high-income, latte-sipping liberals care about, turns out that's not true either. The demographic that cares the most about climate change are Latinos. They're more convinced it's happening, that it's human caused. They're more worried about it. They're more supportive of action. They're more willing to get personally involved. Okay, and that's what you're seeing here, and here, and here, and across California, and many other places where the Hispanic community is growing. So anyway, it gives you a sense of what you can get out of these maps. Okay, so now I want to come back to that concept of psychological distance again, because when we ask Americans, do you think global warming will harm plants and animals? So not people, but plants and animals, other species. You see that a majority of Americans in almost every county in America think that, yeah, it's going to harm plants and animals. Okay, how about people in the United States? Not so much. How about you personally? Not so much. Okay. So again, for many people, this is just like a faraway problem, doesn't seem like it's urgent and something that we have to take action on immediately. And note here that there are these counties here and here and here. You're seeing the effects in many cases of people of color. So not just Latinos, but African Americans, especially through here. There's a whole region that's geographically called the Black Belt. actually a reference to the black soil in this area, not just the fact that there's a lot of density of African Americans there, Native American tribes, and then some really funny ones. Like you might notice this little yellow spot here in Western New York. I don't have everybody's, you're not able to talk to me, so I'm not going to quiz you on it, what it is. What is that? What's going on there? That's Ithaca, New York. That's Cornell. That's the effect of a university town. Okay. However, when we ask Americans, do you think that schools should teach about the causes, consequences, and potential solutions to global warming? We have found that on average, 75% of Americans across the board say yes, we should be teaching our students about climate change. It's actually one of the highest performing policy items we've ever asked. Okay, so Americans know that they don't know very much about climate change. They do think of this as a long-term, faraway problem, but they do want their kids and their grandkids to know about it because they think it's a long-term problem. Okay, so it's just to say that, and this gets down to the county level. So this is at the level that many school districts, of course, are operating. So you can begin to see, and if you come to these maps, you can actually get a little fact sheet or zoom right in on, because it's an interactive tool. You can zoom right in on your particular location and see what proportion of the public supports education or understands that climate change is happening or human caused or worried about it, and so on and so forth. So I encourage you to come check out the Yale Climate Opinion Maps. Another major framework that we developed early on is called Global Warming 6 Americas. And that's really starting from the cardinal rule that it's vital to always understand who is your audience. Who are they? What do they know? What do they think they know? Who do they trust? Where do they get their information? What are their underlying values? Okay, because it's only once you know who they are that you can go more than halfway to meet them where they are and help them take the next step in their learning journey. Okay, now that was so simple to say, but so many of us in this community tend to say, I want to talk about where I am. Okay, I've been studying climate change for 30 years. Can we please talk about, carbon border adjustment taxes? Like, can we please talk about that? That is not an appropriate conversation. Or the role of clouds in climate models. Can we talk about that? Terrible topic to talk about with the vast majority of humanity. Okay, so it really is understand your audience. Where are they? And then meet them where they are and help them take the next step in their learning journey. So to try to help with that, we developed this framework called Global Warming 6 Americas. Let me quickly introduce you to them. First, a group we call the Alarmed, 26% of the country as of just a few months ago. These are people who are fully convinced it's happening, it's human caused, it's urgent, they strongly support action, but they don't know what to do. Okay, so they're worried, they just don't know what to do. Then comes a group we call the Concerned, 28%. These are people who think it's happening, human caused, and serious, but they still think of the impacts as distant. So yes, they support action, but they don't prioritize it yet. They don't understand why this is such an important and urgent problem. Then comes the Cautious at 18%. These are people on the fence, still kind of confused. Is it real? Is it not? Is it human? Is it natural? Is it a serious problem? Is it overblown? They're paying attention, but they're just kind of confused. Then comes a group we call the Disengaged, small, but I think very important, 5%, who basically say, you know what? I don't think I've even heard that term global warming or climate change before. I've never seen it. I don't hear about it in the media I watch. No one I know ever talks about it. I don't know what the causes, consequences, or solutions are. So it's not typically a political ideology barrier or anything like that. They just don't know about it. Then comes a group we call the Doubtful at 12%. And these are people who say, I don't think it's real, but if it is, it's just natural cycles. Nothing we had anything to do with, nothing we can do anything about. So they don't really see it as much of a risk. And then last but not least, the group we call the Dismissive, who are firmly convinced it's not real, it's not human caused, it's not a serious problem. And the great majority of whom literally tell us that they're conspiracy theorists. They say it's a hoax, it's scientists making up data, it's a UN plot to take away American sovereignty, it's a get-rich scheme by Al Gore and his friends, and many other such conspiracy-type narratives. Now, vitally important to note is that they are 10% of the country. They're only 10% of the country. but they're a really loud 10%, they're a really vocal 10%, and they've tended to dominate the public square to such an extent that the other 90% self-censor. Okay, it's called what we call the spiral of climate silence, where people don't talk about climate change because they presume that half or more of other citizens are dismissive of climate change. They're not. 9 out of 10 of Americans are more than happy to have a constructive conversation about climate change. Okay, but the dismissive, who are also more than adequately represented in Congress and in the government right now, have so dominated the public square that most people don't talk about it. Climate change has joined sex, religion, and politics as taboo topics at the Thanksgiving Day table. Like, don't bring up climate change. You don't want to set off Uncle Bob. And it's often an Uncle Bob. Okay, so here are these 6 different audiences that each need very different communication strategies. And just one way to give you a sense that there are completely different conversations happening in this country all at the same time, we've asked Americans, if you could ask an expert on global warming one question, what would you ask? So the disengaged are still at this very fundamental question of, is it really even happening? The dismissive are at an even earlier stage of, isn't it a hoax? And then you see that their primary question is the same as the doubtful and the cautious. How do you know that it's human caused? Okay, so they're still very early in their learning journey of those 5 key ideas. Whereas the alarmed and concerned have very different questions in mind. What can we do? And they don't know. Okay, they don't know what they can do as individuals, what we can do as communities, as cities, as states, as the country, and even the world. They just don't yet know what can we do. And increasingly, we're starting to see this question, is there still time? There is, but it is getting short. And then just to put this in long-term context, we've been tracking changes since, since 2008. I'm just showing the last decade here. And what I want you to see here is that 10 years ago, the alarmed were at 15% and the dismissive were at 11%. So essentially, these 2 groups at either end of this spectrum who were the most engaged with climate change were essentially tied. For every 1 alarmed, there was 1 dismissive. Okay. Fast forward 10 years, and the alarmed have grown pretty dramatically. The dismissive really haven't changed very much, but now there are 2.5 alarmed for every 1 dismissive. And that represents a fundamental shift in the underlying social, cultural, and political climate of climate change. It goes a long way to helping us understand why the country at the federal level and at the state level and at the local level and in the private sector and in civil society has taken a whole variety of major actions to address climate change. Last 5 weeks accepted, obviously. So it's just to say that this represents a fundamental shift as Americans have, in fact, become more concerned, more engaged with this issue, though we clearly have a long way to go. So just to end here, I would just say, again, back to these cornerstones of climate literacy, scientists agree. It's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. And again, how important it is to know who your audience is and meet them where they are. So just on that, I'm going to quickly show you a couple resources that we've made available. So hopefully you can still see my screen. This is our climate YPCCC website. You can sign up and get research updates as we release new studies, which is pretty often. And then over here in tools and interactives, you can find our climate opinion maps. You can actually roll your own map that's just information about your specific location. A very useful SASE 6 America Super Short Survey tool. So this is actually a tool, and let me just quickly show it, where you can go and you can upload the 4 questions. If you have your students just answer those 4 questions, you can upload an Excel sheet and get their results, like which of the 6 Americas are they in? And we're finding a lot of educators are using this tool to both better understand their students, but also as an activity to engage their students. And then the last thing I'll point to is our resources for educators, 6 through 12. We've taken a lot of these tools and insights that we've developed and tried to convert them into curricula that you can use with your students. And then the other last thing to point to back here is our Climate News Service and National Radio program, which again, we're finding a lot of educators now using. So especially those radio stories, because actually the San Francisco School District just redesigned their chemistry program. So a whole new curriculum. And what they've done is taken advantage of like 30 of our short stories, because when they're teaching students, say, about how CO2 in the atmosphere gets absorbed by the oceans and causes ocean acidification, they can learn the chemistry of that, but then they can listen to a story of an oyster fisherman who is reporting on how the acidifying oceans are basically making it impossible for them to grow baby oysters. So is to help bring a human voice and the consequences of these chemical changes to the conversation. So I would encourage you to check these out. And the thing primarily to point to is you can browse these stories by topic, and under category, you've got a whole bunch of education things, which in part are stories about educators taking action in their own schools, in their own communities, and really are examples of things that educators anywhere can do, including students themselves. So with that, I will stop and we can turn to questions.
Well, thank you so much, Tony. Really have appreciated your work for so many years and turned to it in my own research and pointed others to it. So thank you so much for that overview. We're a little bit behind, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to amalgamate a lot of things that I heard into one question to put it out there. Very simple one. If you could choose one driver that changes perspectives and beliefs that you think is the most impactful, what do you think it would be?
Well, I'm going to give you two. One is leadership. Okay. In political science, we call these political elite cues, which is just a fancy way of saying that when leaders lead, followers follow, especially in a context where most people understand that they don't know much about climate change. They don't know much about heart surgery. They don't know much about how their car works. And so we go to experts and we trust experts. And yes, most Americans actually still do trust experts. There has been a decline in trust, but it's not a complete cratering by any means. Most Americans still trust climate scientists at the very top. They trust weathercasters and NOAA scientists and so on, and NASA scientists at the very top, and teachers, okay, educators who they trust their children with. So I would just say that leadership, and I mean that in its broadest sense, not just political leaders, but leaders, community leaders like teachers are incredibly important. The second, though, is kids. So we actually did a study 10 years ago where we looked at, we studied adults and their teenage kids because we were interested in what were the arrows of causality. And I mean, we need to redo this study and we're hoping to, but what we found is that, and I will say this as the parent, proud parent of a now college, about soon to be college graduate, parents can in fact influence their kids, especially when it came to things like clean energy or turning out the damn lights. But what we found is that kids tend to have a much stronger influence on their parents. And there are so many stories, including among Republican leaders who became climate champions because their kids said, Mom, Dad, you need to start protecting my future. You need to start taking climate change seriously. So I'm just saying that while as educators, we of course are always first and foremost concerned about what we are teaching our students and what they are taking away from these lessons, do not forget that your students themselves are some of the most powerful influences in their social networks to bring this new science, these new ideas back to their own families.
Well, you couldn't have possibly teed this next section up for me any better to jump into thinking about how educators can communicate and engage and ground their own thoughts and beliefs to share them with their students in a meaningful way. So thank you so much for being here, for talking, and for giving us that overview.